national security issues. His remarks are an hour.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Woodsum. I'm a sophomore in the College of Arts and Sciences. And on behalf of the Georgetown University Lecture Fund, the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, and the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. In just a few moments, we'll be underway. But first, I would like to introduce you to a very special member of our campus, the Dean of the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to the Honorable Dr. Robert Gallucci.
Thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the School of Foreign Service and the Lecture Fund and the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy, I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to introduce today's speaker. A decade or so ago, another political figure with aspirations to change his residence to a coveted address on Pennsylvania Avenue gave a major foreign policy address from this podium. Then Governor Clinton found Gaston Hall a good venue in which to do that, and maybe this a lucky podium. Senator John Kerry graduated from Yale University. Soon afterwards, he entered the Navy and went to war, becoming a swift boat officer in Vietnam on a gunboat in the Mekong Delta. For his actions in the war, Senator Kerry received a Silver Star, a Bronze Star with Combat V, and 3 awards of the Purple Heart. I would note here that there is a current debate between those who believe that decisions about the conduct of war need to be made by civilians, and those who question that proposition when civilians have no first-hand knowledge of combat. Whatever your view, it is clear that Senator Kerry has that first-hand knowledge. Senator Kerry's biography notes that he grew to question the war in Vietnam, and on his return to the United States, became a co-founder of Vietnam Veterans of America and a spokesperson for Vietnam Veterans Against the War. In that role, in 1971, he testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, prompting Senator Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island to express the hope that Kerry, quote, might one day be a colleague of this body. It would take 14 years, but so he would be. Following his discharge from the service, Senator Kerry served as prosecutor and a private practice lawyer before entering Massachusetts politics. He won election as lieutenant governor in 1982, and in 1984 was elected as United States Senator. He has been re-elected to the Senate in 1990, 1996, and in 2002. Senator Kerry is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and was a leader in pressing for both normalizing relations with Vietnam and getting the fullest possible accounting for U.S. servicemen missing in action from the Vietnam War. On December 1st of last year, it was announced that Senator Kerry was forming an exploratory campaign committee for the Democratic nomination for the presidency of the United States. I am pleased and honored to welcome Senator John Kerry to Georgetown to share his thoughts on foreign policy challenges facing this country. Senator Kerry. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dean Gallucci, thank you very much. Megan, thank you for your generous introduction, and thank you all for cutting classes or taking an excuse to come out here. I didn't know this was a lucky podium. This is evidently the place where public servants come looking for public housing, I guess. Dean Gallucci, thank you for your welcome to this historic hall And I really am privileged to speak here, and I'm grateful to all of you for taking the time to come and to share some thoughts with me. I thank you, Dean, for the leadership you've brought to this school and the effort to understand the world around us and practice the most difficult profession, diplomacy. And after today, gratefully, I will be privileged to say, as a refugee from Massachusetts, to paraphrase President Kennedy, that I have experienced the best of Jesuit education. A Georgetown foreign policy speech and a Boston College degree. Thank you. As our government conducts one war and prepares for another, I come here today to this historic place to make clear that we can do a better job of making our country safer and stronger. We need a new approach to national security, a bold and progressive internationalism that stands in stark contrast to the too often belligerent and myopic unilateralism of the Bush administration. I offer this new course at a critical moment for the country that we love and the world in which we live and lead. Thanks to the work and sacrifice of generations who opposed aggression and defended freedom for others as well as for ourselves, America now stands as the world's foremost power, and we should be proud. Not since the age of the Romans have one people achieved such preeminence. But we are not the Romans. We do not seek an empire. We are Americans, trustees of a vision and a heritage that commit us to the values of democracy and to the universal cause of human rights. So while we can be proud, we must be purposeful and we must be mindful of our principles, and we must be patient, aware that there is no such thing as the end of history. With great power comes grave responsibility. As we are all of us too aware, since September 11th, the gravity of the times and the greatness of the stakes have changed. Having won the Cold War, a brief season of content has been succeeded by a war against terrorism, which is an assault on the very progress we have made. Throughout our history, in peaceful exertion and in armed struggle, we were steadfast. We were right on the central issue of freedom, and we prevailed. And because we prevailed, the world is a far better place than it was or would otherwise have been. The world today has a strong democratic core shaped by American ingenuity, sacrifice, and spirit. But on the periphery are many unstable and dangerous places where terrorists seek to impose a medieval dark age. As we learn so brutally and so personally, we do face a new threat, but we also face a renewed choice between isolation in a perilous world, which I believe is impossible in any event, and engagement to shape a safer world, which is the urgent imperative of our time. A choice between those who think you can build walls to keep the world out, and those who want to tear down the barriers that separate us from them, between those who want America to somehow go it alone and those who want America to lead the world towards freedom. The debate over how the United States should conduct itself in the world is not new, as all of you study here. After all, what is today's unilateralism but the right's old isolationist impulse in modern guise? At its core is a familiar and beguiling illusion that America can escape an entangling world, that we can wield our enormous power without incurring obligations to others, and that we can pursue our national interests in arrogance and in ways that make a mockery of our nation's ideals. I am here today to reject the narrow vision of those who would build walls to keep the world out, or who would prefer to strike out on our own instead of forging coalitions and step by step creating a new world of law and mutual security. I believe that the Bush administration's blustering unilateralism is wrong and even dangerous for our country. In practice, it has meant alienating our longtime friends and allies, alarming potential foes, and spreading anti-Americanism around the world. And too often, they have forgotten that energetic global leadership is a strategic imperative for America, not a favor that we do for other countries. Leading the world's most advanced democracies isn't mushy multilateralism. It amplifies America's voice and extends our reach. And working through global institutions doesn't tie our hands. It invests U.S. aims with greater legitimacy and dampens the fear and the resentment that our preponderant power sometimes inspires in others. In a world growing more, not less interdependent, unilateralism and arrogance are formulas for isolation and for shrinking influence. And as much as some in the White House may desire it, America cannot opt out of a networked world. We can do better than we are doing today. And those who seek to lead have a duty to offer a clear vision of how we make Americans safer and make America more trusted and respected in the world. That vision is defined by looking to our best traditions, to the tough-minded strategy of international engagement and leadership that was forged by Wilson and Roosevelt in 2 world wars and by Truman and Kennedy in the Cold War. These leaders recognized that America's safety depends on energetic leadership to rally the forces of freedom, and they understood that to make the world safe for democracy and individual liberty, we needed to build international institutions dedicated to establishing the rule of law over the law of the jungle. That's why Roosevelt pushed so hard for the United Nations and the World Bank and the IMF. It's why Truman insisted not only on creating NATO, but also on a Marshall Plan to speed Europe's recovery. It's why Kennedy not only faced down the Soviets during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and launched the Peace Corps in order to put American idealism in work in developing countries. He spoke out for an America strong because of its ideals as well as its weapons. For us today, the past is truly prologue. The same principles and strength of purpose must guide us now. Our task now is to update that tradition, to forge a bold, progressive internationalism for the global age. As I said last summer in New York, for Democrats to win America's confidence, we must first convince Americans that we will keep them safe. And you can't do that by avoiding the subjects of national security, foreign policy, and military preparedness. Nor can we let our national security agenda be defined by those who reflexively oppose any U.S. military intervention anywhere, who see U.S. power as mostly a malignant force in world politics, who place a higher value on achieving multilateral consensus than on necessarily protecting our vital interests. Americans deserve a better choice than the false choice between force without diplomacy or diplomacy without force. I believe they deserve a principled diplomacy, backed by undoubted military might, based on an enlightened self-interest, not the zero-sum logic of power politics, a diplomacy that commits America to lead the world toward liberty and prosperity, a bold, progressive internationalism that focuses not just on the immediate and the imminent, but insidious dangers that can mount over the next years and decades, dangers that span the spectrum from the denial of democracy to the destructive weapons to endemic poverty and epidemic disease. These are, in the truest sense, not just issues of international order and security, but vital issues of our own national security. So now, how would this approach work? How would this bold progressive internationalism differ from the Bush administration's erratic unilateralism and very reluctant engagement? The answer starts by understanding the nature and the source of the threat that we face. While we must remain determined to defeat terrorism, it isn't only terrorism we are fighting. It's the beliefs that motivate terrorists. A new ideology of hatred and intolerance has arisen to challenge America and liberal democracies. It seeks a war of Islam, as defined by extremists, against the rest of the world, and we must be clear, its epicenter is in the greater Middle East. It's critical that we recognize that conditions that are breeding this virulent new form of anti-American terrorism, if you look at countries stretching from Morocco through the Middle East and beyond, broadly speaking, the Western Muslim world, what you see is a civilization under extraordinary stress. The region's political and economic crisis is vividly captured in a report written by Arab scholars for the United Nations Development Program and by the Arab Fund for Social and Economic Development. Let me quote: "The wave of democracy that transformed governance in most of the world has barely reached the Arab states. The freedom deficit undermines human development and is one of the most painful manifestations lagging political development." According to Freedom House, there are no full-fledged democracies among the 16 Arab states of the Middle East and North Africa. The Middle East, however, is not monolithic. There are governments making progress and struggling effectively with change in Jordan, Morocco, and Qatar. And Syria, Saudi Arabia, Libya, Iraq, Sudan remain among the 10 least free nations in the world. Political and economic participation among Arab women is the lowest in the world, and more than half of Arab women are still illiterate. And these countries are among the most economically isolated in the world, with very little trade apart from the oil royalties which flow to those at the very top. Since 1998, the share of world trade held by the 57 member countries of the Organization of the Islamic Conference has fallen from 15% to just 4%. The same countries attracted only $13.6 billion worth of foreign direct investment 2 years ago. That is just $600 million, or only 5% more than Sweden, which has only 9 million people compared to the 1.3 billion people in that conference. In 1969, the GDP of South Korea and of Egypt were almost identical. Today, South Korea boasts one of the 20th largest economies in the world, while Egypt's remains economically frozen almost exactly where it was 30 years before. A combination of harsh political repression, economic stagnation, lack of education and opportunity, and rapid population growth has proven simply explosive. The streets are full of young people who have no jobs, no prospects, no voice. State-controlled media encourage a culture of self-pity, victimhood, and blame shifting. And this is the breeding ground for present and future hostility to the West and our values. From this perspective, it is clear that we need more than a one-dimensional war on terror. Of course we need to hunt down and destroy those who are plotting mass murder against Americans and innocent people from Africa to Asia to Europe. We must drain the swamp of terrorists. But you don't have a prayer of doing so if you leave the poison sources to gather and flow again. That means that we must help the vast majority of people of the greater Middle East to build a better future. We need to illuminate an alternative path to a futile jihad against the world, a path that leads to deeper integration of the greater Middle East into modern world order. The Bush administration has a plan for waging war, but no plan for winning the peace. It has invested mightily in the tools of destruction, but meagerly in the tools of peaceful construction. It offers the peoples in the greater Middle East retribution and war, but little hope for liberty and prosperity. What America needs today is a smarter, more comprehensive and far-sighted strategy for modernizing the greater Middle East. It should draw on all of our nation's strengths, military might, the world's largest economy, the immense moral prestige of freedom and democracy, and our powerful alliances. Let me emphasize that last asset in this mission, our alliances. This isn't a task which we should or need to shoulder all alone. If anything, our transatlantic partners have a greater interest than we do in an economic and political transformation in the greater Middle East. They are closer to the front lines, more heavily dependent on oil imports, prime magnets for immigrants seeking jobs, easier to reach with missiles, and just as vulnerable to terrorism. Meanwhile, NATO is searching for a new mission. What better way to revitalize the most successful and enduring alliance in history than to reorient it around the common threat to the global system that we have built over more than half a century of struggle and sacrifice. The administration has tried to focus NATO on the Middle East, but its own high-handed treatment of our European allies on everything, from Iraq to the Kyoto Climate Change Treaty, has strained relations nearly to the breaking point, to the point that a chancellor who is an ally runs against the United States in order to get elected. With creative leadership, the United States can enlist our allies in a sustained multilateral campaign to build bridges between the community of democracies and the greater Middle East, not just for them, but for us too. Here, in my view, is what this strategy should look like. First, destroying al-Qaeda and other anti-American terror groups must remain our top priority. And while the administration has largely prosecuted that part with vigor, it has also made costly mistakes. The biggest, in my view, was their reluctance to translate their robust rhetoric into American military engagement in Afghanistan and get the job done. They relied too much on local warlords to carry the fight against our enemies, and this permitted many al-Qaeda members, and according to the evidence, including Osama bin Laden himself, to slip through our fingers. Now the administration must redouble their efforts to track them down, and we need to pressure Pakistan to get control of the territories along the Afghanistan border, which have literally become a haven for terrorists. Second, without question, we need to disarm Saddam Hussein. He is a brutal, murderous dictator leading an oppressive regime, and we all know the litany of his offenses. The reason I think we need to really think about him is because he presents a particularly grievous threat through the consistency with which he is prone to miscalculation. He miscalculated an 8-year war with Iran. He miscalculated the invasion of Kuwait. He miscalculated America's response to that act of naked aggression. He miscalculated the result of setting oil rigs on fire. He miscalculated the impact of sending Scuds into Israel and trying to assassinate a former American president. He miscalculated his own military strength, and he miscalculated the Arab world's response to his misconduct. And now he is miscalculating America's response to his continued deceit and his consistent grasp for weapons of mass destruction. That is why the world, through the United Nations Security Council, has spoken with one voice, demanding that Iraq disclose and destroy its weapons programs. So the threat of Saddam Hussein with weapons of mass destruction is real, but it's not new. Since the end of the Persian Gulf War, we've known this. Regrettably, the current administration failed to take the opportunity to bring this issue to the United Nations 2 years ago, or immediately after September 11th, when we had such unity of spirit with our allies. And when the administration finally did speak, it was with hasty talk of war instead of a coherent call for Iraqi disarmament. And that made it possible for other Arab nations to shift their focus to the perils of war for themselves, rather than keeping the focus on the perils posed by Saddam Hussein's deadly arsenal. Indeed, for a time, the administration's unilateralism, in effect, elevated Saddam Hussein in the eyes of his neighbors to a level that he never would have achieved on his own, undermining America's own standing with most of the coalition partners who had joined us in repelling the invasion of Kuwait a decade ago. In the UN Security Council Resolution 1441, the United Nations has now affirmed that Saddam Hussein must disarm or face the most serious consequences. Let me make it clear. The burden is resoundingly on Saddam Hussein to live up to the ceasefire agreement he signed and make clear to the world how he disposed of weapons he previously admitted to possessing. But the burden is also clearly on the Bush administration to do the hard work of building a broad coalition at the UN and the necessary work of educating America about the rationale for war. As I have said frequently, and I repeat here today, the United States should never go to war because it wants to. The United States should go to war because we have to. And we don't have to until we have exhausted the remedies available, built legitimacy, earned the consent of the American people, absent, of course, an imminent threat requiring urgent action. The administration must pass this test. I believe they must take the time to do the hard work of diplomacy. They must do a better job of making their case to the American people and to the world. I have no doubt of the outcome of war itself, should it be necessary. We will win. But what matters is not just what we win, but what we lose. We need to make certain that we have not unnecessarily twisted so many arms, created so many reluctant partners, abused the trust of Congress or the American people, or strained so many relations that the longer-term and more immediate vital war on terror is made more difficult. And we should be particularly concerned that we do not go alone or essentially alone if we can avoid it, because the complications and costs of post-war Iraq would be far better managed, shared with the United Nations participation. And while American security must never be ceded to any institution or to another institution's decision, I say to the President, show respect for the process of international diplomacy, because it is not only right, it can make America stronger and show the world some appropriate patience to building a genuine coalition. Mr. President, do not rush to war. I also say to the United Nations, show respect for your own mandates. Do not find refuge in excuses and equivocation. Stand up for the rule of law, not just in words, but in deeds, not just in theory, but in reality. Stand up for our common goal, either bringing about Iraq's peaceful disarmament or the decisive military victory of a multilateral coalition. Now, third, with respect to the Middle East, as we continue our focus on that area, the U.S. must look beyond stability alone as the linchpin of our relationships. We must place increased focus on the development of democratic values and human rights as the keys to long-term security. If we learned anything from our failure in Vietnam, it is that regimes removed from the people cannot permanently endure. They must reform, or they will finally crumble, despite the efforts of the United States. We must side with and strengthen the aspirations of those seeking positive change. America needs to be on the side of the people, not the regimes that keep them down. In the 1950s, as the sun was setting on European colonialism, a young senator named John Kennedy went to the Senate floor and urged the Eisenhower administration not to back France against rebellious Algeria. He recognized that the United States could only win the Cold War by being true to our values, by championing the independence of those aspiring to be free. What's at issue today is not U.S. support for colonial powers out of touch with history, but for autocratic regimes out of touch with their own people. We as Americans must be agents of hope as well as enemies of terrorism. We must help bring modernity to the greater Middle East. We must make significant investments in the education and human infrastructure in developing countries. The globalization of the last decade taught us that simple measures like buying books and family planning can expose, rebut, isolate, and defeat the apostles of hate so that children are no longer brainwashed into becoming suicide bombers and terrorists are deprived the ideological breeding grounds. I believe that we must reform and increase our global aid and focus on the missions of education and health, of freedom for women, and economic development for all. We must embark on a major initiative of public diplomacy to bridge the divide between Islam and the rest of the world. We must make avoidance of the clash of civilizations the work of our generation, engaging in a new effort to bring to the table a new face of the Arab world, Muslim clerics, mullahs, imams, and secular leaders, demonstrating for the entire world a peaceful religion which can play an enormous role in isolating and rebutting those practitioners who would pervert Islam's true message. Fourth, the Middle East isn't on the Bush administration's trade agenda, and we need to put it there. The United States and its transatlantic partners should launch a high-profile Middle East trade initiative designed to stop the economic regression in the Middle East and spark investment, trade, and growth in the region. It should aim at dismantling trade barriers that are among the highest in the world and encouraging participation in world trade policy and ending the deep economic isolation of many of the region's countries. I propose the following policy goals. We should build on the success of the Clinton administration's Jordan Free Trade Agreement. Since the United States reduced tariffs on goods made in, quote, qualifying industrial zones, Jordan's exports to the U.S. jumped from 16 million to 400 million, creating about 40,000 jobs. Let's provide similar incentives in other countries that agree to join the WTO, stop boycotting Israel, and supporting Palestinian violence against Israel, and open up their economies. We should also create a general duty-free program for the region, just as we've done in the Caribbean Basin Initiative and in the Andean Trade Preference Act. And again, we should set some conditions: full cooperation in the war on terror, beating back or taking anti-corruption measures, non-compliance with the Israel boycott, and respect for core labor standards and progress towards human rights. Let us be clear. Our goal is not to impose some Western free market ideology on the greater Middle East. It's to open up a region that is now closed to opportunity, an outpost of economic exclusion and stagnation in a fast globalizing world. These countries suffer from too little globalization, not too much. And without greater investment, without greater trade within the region and with the outside world, without the transparency and legal protections that modern economies need in order to thrive, how will these communities ever be able to grow fast enough to provide jobs and better living standards for these enormous numbers of people in their growing population, in their disenfranchised population? We need to extend the benefits of globalization to people in the greater Middle East and the developing world in general. And we also need to confront globalization's dark side. We should use the leverage of capital flows and trade to lift, not lower, labor and environmental standards. We should strengthen the IMF's ability to prevent financial panics from turning into full-scale economic meltdowns, such as we've seen in Argentina. And in the Middle East especially, we need to be sensitive to the fears that globalization will corrupt or completely submerge traditional cultures and mores. I believe we can do these things. Fifth and finally, we must have a new vision and a renewed engagement to reinvigorate the Mideast peace process. This administration made a grave error when it disregarded almost 70 years of American friendship and leadership in the Middle East and the efforts of every president of the last 30 years. A great nation like ours should not be dragged kicking and resisting, should not have to be pressured to the task of making peace. A great nation like ours should be leading the effort to make peace, or we risk encouraging through our inaction the worst instincts of an already troubled region. Israel is our ally, the only true democracy in this troubled region, and we know that Israel, as a partner, is fundamental also to our security. From Truman through Clinton, America has always been committed to that effort, to Israel's independence and survival, and we won't waver. Israel's security, however, will be best assured over the long term if real and lasting peace can be brought to the Middle East. I know from my own trips to Israel that the majority of the Israeli people understand and expect that one day there will be a Palestinian state. Their frustration is that they don't see a committed partner in peace on the Palestinian side. Palestinians need to stop the violence. It is a fundamental building block of the effort of the peace process. And the Palestinian leadership does need to reform in that process, not only for the future of the Palestinian people, but also for the effort to make peace. I believe that Israel would respond to that new partner. After all, Israel has already indicated its willingness to freeze settlements, and the freezing of those settlements is the policy of the United States in the Mitchell Agreement. And a Palestinian state will emerge as part of a comprehensive peace process. Without demanding unilateral concessions, the United States must mediate a series of confidence-building steps which start, I should say restart, down the road to peace. Both parties must walk this path together simultaneously, and the world can help them do it. While maintaining our long-term commitment to Israel's existence and security, the United States must work to keep both sides focused on the game of peace. Extremists must not be allowed to control the process. American engagement and successful mediation are not only essential to peace in this war-torn area, but also critical to the success of our own efforts in the war on terror. When I visited the region last year, in meetings with King Abdullah of Jordan, President Mubarak of Egypt, and Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, it became patently clear to me that September 11th changed the imperatives of each of these countries. The Bush administration has missed an opportunity to enlist much greater support in a peace process, and it needs to refocus on this urgent priority now. The transformation of the Middle East, which can come from all of the efforts I've just talked about, will determine much of our future. But we also have to look to the challenges of the rest of the planet. We need to build a new and more effective role for the United States in the rest of this complex world. And the central challenge for the United States is to undertake and lead the most global, comprehensive effort in the history to deal with proliferation generally and nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, lost or loose in a dangerous world. It is no secret that there are those lurking in the shadows, eager to capitalize on a deadly market for nuclear materials held in insecure facilities around the world. 5 years ago, authorities seized a nuclear fuel rod that had been stolen from the Congo. The security guard entrusted with protecting it had simply lent out his keys to the storage facility. And 2 years later, even after near disaster, the facility was guarded only by a few underpaid guards with rusty gates and a simple padlock. The potential consequences are fearful and undeniable. In October of 2001, we picked up warnings that terrorists had acquired a 10-kiloton nuclear bomb. If detonated in New York City, hundreds of thousands of Americans would have died and most of Manhattan would have been destroyed. Senator Sam Nunn had an important warning. He said this intelligence report was judged to be false. It was never judged to be implausible or impossible. This administration's approach to the menace of loose nuclear materials is strong on rhetoric, but short on execution. It relies primarily and unwisely on the threat of military preemption against terrorist organizations, which can be defeated if they are found, but will not be deterred by our military might alone. It is time instead for the most determined, all-out effort ever summoned or initiated to secure the world's nuclear materials and the materials that create the weapons of mass destruction. We must offer our own blueprint for the mission of threat reduction, comprehensively securing materials and keeping them from falling into wrong hands. That demands a global perspective and international action. The only answer, the clear imperative, is a multilateral framework implementing a global consensus in which we secure the weapons of mass destruction and prevent them from falling under the control of terrorists, which represents the most serious international security threat today. It warrants an urgent and global response, a response of cooperation, my friends, that can only come if the United States leads. We must marshal an international effort to inventory and secure the materials wherever they may be in whatever quantity. We must create mechanisms to help those that would be responsible stewards but lack the financial and the technical means to succeed. And we must establish worldwide standards for the security and safekeeping of nuclear material and define a new standard of international legitimacy, linking the stewardship of nuclear materials under universally accepted protocols, and that will be the key to the acceptance in the community of nations. Nowhere is the need more clear or urgent than in North Korea. There, the Bush administration has offered what I call the merry-go-round policy, They got up on their high horse, they whooped and they hollered, they rode around in circles, and they ended up right back where they started in the first place. By suspending talks initiated by the Clinton administration, which many of us criticized them for at the time, then asking for talks but with new conditions, then refusing to talk under the threat of nuclear blackmail, then reversing that refusal as North Korea's master of brinkmanship upped the ante, the administration created confusion and literally put the despot Kim Jong-il in the driver's seat. By publicly taking military force, negotiations, and sanctions all off the table at the same time, the administration tied its own hands behind its back. And now, finally, they are rightly working with allies in the region, finally coming back to where President Clinton left off. They've gotten off the merry-go-round, but the great question for all of us is obviously why they ever were so committed to a unilateralist dogma that you'd get on it in the first place. Now, so too has the administration missed opportunities to address the downside of globalization. How? By creating an upside. Relief for nations around the globe struggling against environmental degradation, global health crises, debt relief in exchange for better development policies and improved trade relationships. We need to show the face of enlightened, not robber baron capitalism, something that I will expand on more in the months ahead. But one of the clearest opportunities missed is the environment. America has not led but fled on the issue of global warming. President Bush's declaration that Kyoto Protocol was simply dead on arrival spoke for itself, and it spoke in dozens of languages as his words whipped instantly around the globe. But what the administration failed to see was that Kyoto was not just an agreement. It was the product of 160 nations working together over 10 years based on the best science available to each and every one of them. And the United States just dismissed it. We didn't aim to mend it. We didn't aim to sit down with our allies and find a compromise. We didn't aim for a dialogue. The administration was simply ready to aim and fire, period. And the target they hit was our international reputation. This country can and should aim higher than preserving its place as the world's largest unfettered polluter. We owe better to generations to come. I believe we should assert, not abandon, our leadership in addressing global economic degradation, the warming of the atmosphere that we share with the 96% of the rest of humankind. We should be the world's leader in sustainable development policies. We should be the world's leader in technology transfer and technical assistance to meet a host of environmental and health challenges globally, as well as to liberate America by creating energy independence here at home. I believe that we need to return to the negotiating table and recognize that our friends in the fight for the environmental cleanup are also the friends we rely on to help clean out the stables of terrorism. This is a matter of our own national security. Let me offer one last example: the threat of disintegration and chaos that rises steadily in Africa as the continent is increasingly devastated by HIV/AIDS. More than 29 million people on that continent are afflicted with the disease. Africa has 11% of the world's population, but 70% of all the people in the world living with HIV/AIDS. Responding is not only morally right, but deeply practical and fundamentally important to the cause of global stability and ultimately our own safety. How can countries or whole continents torn apart by an untreated epidemic successfully resist the call to violence, terror, and the trade of weapons of mass destruction. There is much that we can do. We have learned that we can change behavior through prevention and education programs. And if we make treatment available for those already sick, we can stop the transmission from mother to child. And we can reduce the growing number of AIDS orphans if we start adding voluntary counseling, testing, and treatment of parents and caregivers to children. Yet the Bush administration, intent on appeasing its right wing, assails population control while it neglects AIDS, even as that disease threatens to destroy whole populations. We must put our national interests in the claims of compassion ahead of political calculation and conservative dogma. The United States must be a leader in assembling an international coalition with other governments and with the private sector partners, a coalition with the will and resources to confront the pandemic of HIV/AIDS with the same determination that we bring to the war on terrorism. I challenge the Bush administration to develop and implement a comprehensive strategy to help the countries in Africa win the war against AIDS in their own backyard, backed by the substantial increase in resources beginning with $2.5 billion for the upcoming fiscal year. That's how the United States of America makes a difference. Taken together, I believe that all of these proposals I have set forth present a far better vision for how we deal with the rest of the world, a better vision for how we build relationships, and how doing so will make America safer. There are other things that we need to do. I also believe there's a better vision for military transformation, a better vision for intelligence gathering, and a far more effective way of achieving homeland security and domestic preparedness. I intend also to lay out detailed proposals on each of this in the coming months. This is a fateful time, my friends. For all those of you in college looking towards the future, this is a fateful time. A time for new American leadership in the world and new American leadership here that sets before us the great challenges and honestly addresses what we must do to meet them. The effort will not be easy, the task will not be simple, and success will not be swift. But it's our challenge to look to the long term, beyond the next election, to the next generation, bending the course of history, recognizing that other nations share it with us, and joining with them in resolve and hope, thereby making safer the life of America and making better the life of the world. With a progressive internationalism shaped by our bedrock values and quiet confidence in our strength and in our cause, we can once again demonstrate to an anxious world America's resolve to bear the burdens and pay the price of leadership so that we may, as President Kennedy said on a cold January day long ago, assure the survival and success of liberty. Thank you for the privilege of speaking here today.
Thank you, Senator Kerry. Ladies and gentlemen, the Senator is prepared to take some questions. I would ask those of you who would like to pose a question to line up, please, at the microphone. I'd ask you also, if you're going to ask a question, to please first identify yourself and then to truly ask a question.
Hi, my name is Courtney Raj. I'm a first-year MSFS student and will be going into the State Department.
Hi, Courtney. Good for you.
Thanks. My question for you is, how do we reconcile the hypocrisy of supporting undemocratic regimes and policies when it is in our national security interest with our professed goals of promoting democracy and development policies? Do we sacrifice our short-term economic goals for long-term, better national security goals of democratic processes?
Courtney, thank you for the question. And the answer is we don't have to sacrifice our short-term economic goals. We have to make a better set of choices here at home with respect to those economic goals. For instance, this administration was prepared to do away with something that we thought created fairness in America, which is the alternative minimum tax. And they were prepared to repay corporations, IBM, GE, Enron, with $33 billion of give back for their years of paying something that was supposed to make America fair. Their choice was to do that. My choice is to apply that money, and incidentally, not to provide a whole series of new Bush tax cuts that are going to go to the wealthiest Americans at the expense of fairness, but apply those things to these urgent national needs, including health care, education, where they make a mockery of leaving no child behind, and to begin to really invest in the choices available to us. So the answer to your question is we need to make a better set of choices of how we allocate the precious resources given to us by the American people, and we need to present the American people with those choices over the course of the next 2 years.
Thank you.
Dave Baker, I'm a freshman in the School of Foreign Service. You talked about the dangers of isolationism on the right, but what about the dangers of isolationism on the left? What about those who call themselves liberals but find more at fault with America than the brutal, misogynist, homophobic regimes in the Middle East? Those who are complacent with regimes that throw acid on the face of women and destroy culture and music? What about those who won't meet force with force, who are complacent in the isolationism of the United States?
Well, I'm an equal opportunity tolerance employer, and I believe that you have to be fair and call it on both sides, and you're absolutely correct. And I said in my speech a moment ago, we cannot also tolerate a kind of inflexible, automatic, knee-jerk rejection of the potential that the United States may at some point in some place need to use force. I learned in Vietnam the hard way of what happens when you lose legitimacy and when you lose the consent of the American people. It's why I believe so strongly in working through the multilateral structures to exhaust the remedies that are available to you. Now, we haven't done that very effectively. And so I believe we have to be absolutely clear on both sides that we have to begin to kind of find the common ground in America and in a sense push the extremes where they belong, which is on the extreme on either side, and find the great American center, which is where most of the progress and the support would come for these kinds of efforts.
Hello, Senator. My name is Nicholas Gowski. I'm a senior studying American Studies. I applaud you for calling on President Bush not to rush to war, but your actions speak louder than your words. And it's quite clear you might not have us rush to war, but go slowly nonetheless. You voted for the war resolution in October. And while you may see that this strategy might get you elected to the presidency, it seems that you're ignoring your core constituency. Even in Massachusetts, in an uncontested election in November, you lost 20% of the vote to people voting just against your support of the war. And you're ignoring the voices of hundreds of thousands of people who have marched in this city in the recent months against the war. Perhaps this middle ground policy would get you elected president, but it represents no significant difference to any of your predecessors. You would still send our brothers and sons off to a war against an enemy that represents no proven threat to the United States. So my question to you is this: what becomes of our country and our political system when people like yourself pursue the Democratic Party nomination to advance their personal ambitions of the presidency, rather than pursuing the presidency to advance the ambitions of the democratic values we hold? Thank you.
I am on a campus, aren't I? I respect your question, I really do. And I respect especially people who are demonstrating against the war. I've been there. I completely respect the voices of dissent that are being exercised today. I take issue with you, however, on the fundamental premise of your question, and also the premise, even incidentally, with respect to the election in Massachusetts. I had a libertarian on the ballot and another person who was a write-in. I lost 20,000 votes to the person who was the write-in. To the libertarian, who knows how to measure, but I was very proud of the fact. I was very proud of the fact that I won 81% of the vote, and that for the first time in Massachusetts history, I ran without any Republican opponent. So I don't agree with that premise, but that's minor. Let's go to the major issue about the war and how you vote and how I voted. I don't see any inconsistency in how I voted at all. And in fact, the way I voted and Joe Biden voted and Hillary Clinton voted and a lot of us voted was the result of a long period of effort with the administration to move them away from unilateralness to go to the UN. And this was a vote. I mean, this is the difficult thing about votes. And maybe one day you'll be in the Senate or in some elected body and you'll have an opportunity to sense that tension. But the fact is, you could have voted no, but. No, I'm not going to give him the power or send a message to the UN that Saddam is serious, but I believe Saddam Hussein is a threat. I believe that leaving this man unfettered with nuclear weapons or other weapons is unacceptable, and that he himself signed an agreement to the world that he would destroy those weapons and make known where they were. That's his agreement. Now, if you don't believe in the United Nations, or you don't believe in the value of agreements, or you don't believe that Saddam Hussein is indeed a threat with nuclear weapons, you shouldn't vote for me. You should go find someone who wants to live in a different world. I believe that it is a threat. And I had a choice between voting no, but I think it's a threat and we ought to do something about it with the UN, or I could vote yes, but I want to make sure you're going to the UN and I don't want you to go unilaterally or preemptively. Either way, it was a but vote. I thought it was more important to vote, given the assurances Colin Powell gave us in the Foreign Relations Committee and the complete change of language of the President of the United States, where he assured us he was going to go to the UN and give the opportunity for the United Nations and the inspections to work. And I said on the floor of the Senate when I voted, I said, if the President of the United States doesn't adhere to what he's saying and committing to us in going to the UN to hold Saddam accountable, if he decides to go preemptively without cause, or he decides to go alone without building the coalition, and again, as a means of circumventing the inspection process if it's working, I will oppose him. So there is no inconsistency whatsoever in my approach. I regret, obviously, that you feel there is, but I will continue to hold the President accountable, and as I set forth as clearly as I can today, anybody who leaves Saddam Hussein to develop these weapons of mass destruction based on his record is courting danger for the American people. This is a man who could decide in 7 years, hey, I got 10 nuclear weapons now. Let's try the mother of all wars, 2010, and turn around and challenge Kuwait again, go for the oil fields again, challenge Israel, and try to be the pan-Arab leader that he has always espoused to be. I'm not prepared to defend America by sitting around and ignoring a United Nations resolution that holds him accountable for the weapons of mass destruction or for his past behavior. And that's why I voted the way I did.
Peace, Senator.
One more.
One last question, please.
Hi, Senator Kerry. My name is Raha. I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service. Thank you for taking my question.
Thank you, Raha, for coming. Glad to catch you. I'm sorry for those people, incidentally, who waited and couldn't answer. I apologize.
Okay. This is in reference to what you said about the war on terror and national security. I'm sure you know about the recent INS detentions and how like people who were from predominantly Muslim countries who had non-immigration status were called upon by the INS to register, and some upon doing so were arrested, detained, and even deported. And even so, like, funnily enough, many of them had applied for a green card, but the INS had sat on their applications for so many years, and then with the war on terror putting the focus on these particular people, then they found themselves suddenly at risk at deportation. And my question to you is, I mean, do you find this unconstitutional? Do you think that this could be unfair stereotyping of a group by the actions of a few? Or do you think this is just a job well done? I mean, what do you say to the families that, you know, have seen their uncles or fathers or sons being taken away?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, go ahead. I just want to hear your answer.
It's a terrific question, and I share with you. And I think there is an increasing awareness among some of my colleagues and friends in the Senate that there are some grievous abuses that have taken place in this country with respect to individuals who are American citizens and/or people who are trying to get in and have legitimate visas or access to visas and sponsors and so forth. I'll just give you an example. I met a fellow who came up to me in an airport who told me that he was a flight instructor and he had been in Florida. He's Middle Eastern, but he's been here for years with an appropriate green card and is transitioning to citizenship. And he was accosted by the FBI in Florida. They spent all this time interrogating him. And then he went back to his home, which was up in Illinois. And in Illinois, he was re-confronted by a group of more zealous and overbearing folks who interrogated him for about 48 hours, at the end of which he was given a lie detector test, hadn't had water, hadn't been able to call anybody, had had no contact. They did not like the results of the lie detector test. He spent the next 88 days in jail until my colleague, Senator Dick Durbin, intervened and managed to get him out. And when I heard this story, I was absolutely astounded. There are people in jail in the United States of America whose names we don't know. There are people in jail who, I'm told, have not had contact to lawyers in our country. So we have to be particularly careful to guarantee that what makes us the nation we are is not lost in overzealotry or insensitivity or in people's busyness that they don't even look at these things and care about what is happening. We have to protect the Constitution of the United States of America. And I regret to say that the Attorney General of the country, in my judgment, has not made that a high enough priority and doesn't focus on it with the kind of caring and sensitivity that an Attorney General of this country ought to. We need to guarantee the rights of people in this country are protected. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you.
Senator Kerry, on behalf of the Georgetown community, I want to thank you very much for an extraordinary speech and also for frank answers to questions. Thank you all very much.
This Sunday on Road to the White House, you'll hear speeches by